I'm Marshall Kozlov, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
On today's episode, I'm joined by my Hudson colleague, Daniel Kochis, to talk about all things NATO. The wrap-up of the 75th anniversary earlier in this month, the questions facing the NATO alliance moving forward, and how questions regarding the Indo-Pacific, the status of NATO within American politics, and of course, future defense spending can be answered from that perspective.
We're facing a different threat from the Cold War. It was just the Soviet Union by and large. Right now we're facing Russia with China, with Iran, with North Korea, and that's not even touching on sort of smaller threats. And so all of these countries are working together more consistently, doing it better. I mean, we just saw a week or two ago that for the first time Chinese aircraft flying alongside Russians aircraft into U.S. airspace near Alaskan. It's never happened before. And so as all of these countries are sort of working together and for lack of a better term, working as allies, why would we want to jettison our greatest advantage, which is our network of alliances, not just in Europe, but also countries like Japan, Australia, and the Indo-Pacific, right?
So hope you all enjoy the conversation, and a huge thank you to the Hudson Institute for supporting the work of this podcast. Daniel Kochis, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
A pleasure to be here today. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, this is a great chance to check in with one of my Hudson colleagues on a big issue facing the U.S. from a national security and foreign policy perspective. Daniel, can you just kick things off by introducing your context, your career, your focus area from a Hudson perspective?
Sure. So I'm relatively new to the Hudson Institute, but not new to the work that's being done here. I've been here about 4 months, so I joined in early April of this year. But previous to that, I spent 11 years at the Heritage Foundation working in their Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. And so I've worked on the issues related to transatlantic relations for some time now. I'm very interested in NATO. I see this as sort of the bedrock of U.S. policy, not just in the European sphere, but across the globe. And really the importance of that. And I've also focused quite a bit on Northern Europe, on the Scandinavian countries, and on the Arctic region as well.
That's a fascinating place to kick things off, especially the way you phrased it around NATO serving as a bedrock for U.S. policy globally, because my initial editorial POV on this episode was, let's talk about the 75th anniversary of NATO, let's talk about Europe, but you're actually giving us a kind of global scale there. So let's start by unpacking that statement.
Right. So from my perspective, U.S. security really begins and ends with transatlantic security. That is sort of the entry point for the United States and the most important piece. And so the global stability that emanates really from a stable North Atlantic is beneficial towards Americans, of course, because of the trade ties, because of the income which is coming in. Our FDI investors, foreign direct investors in the United States are primarily Europeans and vice versa. This is most of where the U.S. money, which is flowing out of the country for investments, is going. And so you have kind of this strange moment in time where we have sort of the U.S. and Europe and our allies in the Indo-Pacific. You have Russia, China, and their allies. And then you have a whole slew of other countries which are sort of in between, somewhere in between. But those same countries, so places like Colombia, India, Indonesia, they're still relying upon the global security, which really rests upon the Transatlantic Alliance and rests upon the security which is provided by NATO. So, global stability for me really is dependent upon NATO. And so it's sort of a broader conversation when you put it in that context.
Something I would love to hear from you is post 75th anniversary meetings and all that. What would you assess the current state of NATO as?
In some ways, I think NATO is actually more united than it has been in a long time. So it's found purpose again. If you remember, Marshall, a few years ago, there was this conversation from the French president where he said, well, maybe, NATO is brain dead. It doesn't really, it sort of is here, but it doesn't really have a mission anymore. So the Russian second invasion of Ukraine has really put all of those questions aside. I mean, everyone can see literally the line in the sand between a NATO country and those that aren't NATO countries. So the Baltic states, for instance, were stuck in the same sphere as Ukraine, being forced into being Soviet satellite republics after the Second World War. But now, obviously, their situation is quite different. Ukrainian cities are being bombed every day, and of course, those cities are not. And the difference is that those are NATO member countries, and Ukraine isn't. So there's literally a line in the sand. Everyone recognizes the importance of NATO, I think, within the alliance, and kind of is in agreement about what needs to be done. So in that respect, NATO is actually, I think, in a very good place. And there has been real improvements in a host of different areas around spending, around defense planning, over the past few years. But there are significant challenges, which we could go into in our discussion today, which the alliance is facing, that they weren't facing necessarily 30, 40 years ago. And so that, I think, makes it sort of a unique case, I think, for the alliance as they move forward.
I like, once again, the phrasing of agreement on what needs to be done. What actually is there agreement on what needs to be done moving forward? Because if you're looking over let's say the 21st century analysis of where NATO sits, there's been a lack of consistency and agreement. So if there is some sort of consensus moving forward now, where is there consensus and where are there open questions that need to be resolved over the coming administrations in the American perspective?
So I think the consensus is really around the threat picture for NATO. So NATO put out a new strategic concept a few years ago in 2022. The last one had been 12 years prior. And so a very different geopolitical picture that they're dealing with. So they were very frank in the strategic concept about the threat from Russia, the threat from China, the threat from Iran. And we saw this even the last few summits and summit declarations this time around coming out of Washington. Very frank assessment about the role that all these countries have played in undermining security of the transatlantic sphere. So Russia is the primary threat to the Euro-Atlantic region. And so obviously that threat perception is a bit different across the alliance. So countries which share a land border or maritime border with Russia, I think, see that as a much more ever-present threat than a country which is perhaps a bit further away. But everyone recognizes that is the primary instability emanating, the primary instability sort of pull coming into Europe. And so you even have, sabotage attacks, these hybrid attacks, which are happening across the alliance space. They're happening not just in countries which are close to Russia, but countries that are a bit further away. So everyone recognizes that. I think everyone recognizes the secondary threat coming from places like China, both a threat in their own right, but also a threat in terms of their support for Russia, the threat coming from Iran, and then the sort of more nebulous threat of instability, so migration, terror attacks, these sort of things typically coming from the southern theater in Europe. But so I think in that respect, everyone is united. I think folks also, generally speaking, recognize that there are significant still capability gaps that need to be rectified. And so this is when you get into the sort of spending conversation. And so by and large, when you look at where the spending picture is now versus just a few years ago, this is a real success story, I think, for NATO. And so this is going to be a long-term project, but everyone, I think, generally speaking, recognizes that defense spending needs to go up and capabilities need to be approved and purchased and maintained at a way that they haven't been in the last 30 years for many countries. So in that respect, I think that there really is quite a bit of agreement within NATO in terms of the threat, what needs to be done, and how to go about doing that. But it's sort of those steps about actually fulfilling. So we've when you look at the last three summits, Washington, Vilnius, and before that Madrid, a lot of great decisions, all the right things, I think, being said and being put on a paper, but it really is about how those decisions are going to be followed through in the next year, in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years that are going to determine, I think, really the sort of security sphere that we find ourselves in at that time.
When we're talking about increasing defense spending at a percentage of GDP basis, how do we make those numbers actually appear tangible and measurable? Because you could spend percentage of GDP on a variety of different systems or strategies that might not actually be the right ones. How should we, from the American perspective, think that through?
That's absolutely right. So these benchmarks that were put into place first came out in 2006, and then they were reiterated and agreed to time after time after that. But so the one benchmark is spending the 2% of GDP of your national GDP on defense, and the second one is within that 2%, spending 20% of that on equipment. So what you don't want to have is a country spending all of their defense budget on things like pensions, and sort of projects which maybe are sort of only quasi in nature, quasi military in nature, and so that is a second benchmark which pretty much every NATO country is now hitting, the 20% benchmark. So that's a good thing. The second one is this planning procedure which has been ongoing now for the last few years, and so with a level of granularity I think that we haven't had in a long time. The sort of NATO military staff is being able to look into what exactly does every country have, not just on paper. What assets do they actually have, and they could bring to bear in terms of a potential future fight. And so the question that the head of the NATO military committee I think recently posed was that the question used to be phrased in terms of, if there was a fight, what could you give me? What could you make available? Now the question is, what would you not make available? So the assumption is that sort of all of your national assets would be made available for that contingency. And so this sort of level of granularity is doing two things. One, it's allowing military planners to be able to be much more precise in terms of, if this happens, this unit is going here, this aircraft is going here, and so being able to sort of cover the whole flank of NATO and knowing exactly which assets or which countries will be in what place and what time. So that's one thing. And two is to be able to see really where the gaps are. And so I think that what we found by and large is that the gaps are typically in sort of higher end enablers that the U.S. oftentimes provides, airlift, long range strikes, these sorts of things, EW. And so it's trying to look at those gaps and help planners within individual countries prioritize where they're spending their precious euros and pounds and what have you. And so being able to look at it from that sort of high level picture and say, well, okay, the alliance needs these assets. It's really best if these countries sort of focus on this and these countries focus on that asset, as opposed to everyone procuring similar systems and not being able to fill all those gaps that we have at certain places. So that I think is going to be a very positive thing, which is going to bear fruit across the next few decades.
One of the big questions facing the alliance, and is definitely a political controversy, is the status of Ukraine vis-a-vis NATO. What is your opinion on both? Let's just say, how about you, if you could just sort of start by outlining the debate and then giving your perspective on that debate, that'd be very helpful.
Sure. So, the question really is, I think, twofold. One is, what is the status of Ukraine going to be vis-a-vis NATO membership? So is Ukraine going to be a NATO member? Is it never going to be a NATO member? What is the timeline and the sort of structure of how that happens? And the second piece is, what is the responsibility or the interest of NATO and the contingent member states in supporting Ukraine, and what does that look like? So the membership piece, I would say, really, I think that there's some countries, there is still some debate here, I think, within the alliance. I think most countries would like to see Ukraine in the alliance. The question is more one of a timeline. Obviously, there's an active war going on, pieces of ground being traded every day. And so how do you make that Article 5, all for one for all clause stand up in that situation? So how do you bring Ukraine into the NATO mix under that? So I think a lot of countries are, there are those countries, including the United States, I think under the Biden administration, and places like Germany, which are not very comfortable really touching this question because they see it as sort of a far off possibility that right now it's not really very helpful because it's just going to sort of divide the alliance to even talk about and get the hopes of Ukraine when it's not really likely to happen. There are other countries, I think, countries which are further east, which have been much more vocally supportive of Ukrainian membership in a much more immediate term. So countries like Poland and the Baltic states have been much more supportive about voicing these opinions. The answer probably lies somewhere in the middle. So some of our colleagues here at Hudson have suggested, which I think is a very good way to sort of handle this puzzle, to issue an invitation to Ukraine. So to make it clear that is where they're going to end up one day. But to make that actual membership, actually joining the alliance, contingent upon when the security reality on the ground is one which is amenable to the member states, actually having Ukraine join. So clearly, right now, that is not the case. But in 6 months, that may be a different picture, or in a year. But leaving Ukraine in the gray zone, I think, is really what has gotten us into this situation. I firmly believe that Ukraine will eventually be a NATO member. And the reason is, one, because we've tried everything else, right? Every other sort of security arrangement that you can have short of NATO membership has fallen short. And so if they're going to survive as an independent country, they're going to have to eventually, I think, get NATO membership. And I think that is beneficial when you look at, the idea of having in the future the largest military in Europe, the defense industry, the innovative drone productions in Ukraine sort of sitting outside of the NATO context doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I think that that's eventually where we're going to land. But the question is sort of making it clear in the interim to Putin that that there is no alternative. And so to try to close that door for him to be able to continue to press Ukraine and leaving them and have them in that gray zone, to make it's extremely important, I think, to make it clear that this is where we in the West see Ukraine as just a matter of time, and we're going to take all the necessary steps to get them there. So that's the first picture. The first question is around actual membership. The second one is around support. Again, I think here there's a bit of variety, of course, in terms of what different member states are doing. You can look at the numbers. The Kiel Institute in Germany does some great work on crunching the numbers in terms of what countries are giving as a percentage of the GDP to Ukraine. But everyone is donating something, whether it's military aid, financial aid, humanitarian aid, typically both. But some are doing more than others in terms of their willingness to support the Ukrainians. But now we're coming up, I think, sort of against this question of, well, what can we afford to give without sort of leaving ourselves exposed? And so a lot of countries, I think, are really sort of facing that question as well. And then there's this sort of nascent conversation that is being had about, well, is there a way for NATO or NATO member states to do a little more to support the Ukrainians? And by that, I mean something like the French have discussed the possibility of putting French troops in, say, Western Ukraine to help free up Ukrainian forces to be able to serve further east, and then to, sort of help protect some of the sort of supplies and infrastructure there, supply depots and infrastructure there. Or the Poles have talked about maybe helping intercept, say, Russian missiles over Western Ukraine. And I think, you've seen even some, the Romanians hitting some targets over the border, which were sort of very close to the Romanian border. So this is sort of another conversation about, is that, for NATO, is that kind of pressing it too far and becoming a true party to the conflict? Or is that something that we as an alliance or even individual member states should be doing?
So many follow-ups to that great answer. So number one, if we think about, let's say, a French presence in Western Ukraine or Polish support when it comes to missile defense, should those be understood as national issues, as in the French are making a decision, the Poles are making a decision, in contrast to a all of NATO decision? How do we think through the rubrics by which we evaluate the escalatory implications of those moves?
Well, I think right now this is being discussed as sort of a national decision. So each country is sort of evaluating it on their own terms. And so the French president, for instance, has made it very clear that if this were to happen, it would be, they wouldn't necessarily be covered under sort of Article 5 if a French troop was injured, say, or killed in a missile attack, right? That this would be a national level decision. Now, of course, in practice, I mean, how does this actually work out the way that it's intended? Anytime you say Article 5, it's ultimately sort of a political question, because everyone is going to get together and decide whether or not is that an Article 5 attack, and how do we respond from that on an individual basis and as an alliance basis. And so if you had, say, boots on the ground from a NATO member state inside Ukraine, and they were sort of being targeted in particular via missile strikes, then maybe that rises from a national question strictly to more of a alliance-wide question. And so, and then there's also, I think, for me, the question about how much of this is trying to message to the Russians that this is a possibility, to try to get them to back off by saying, well, there is more that we can do as opposed to, just giving aid. We, maybe we, institute, a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine or something like this, right? To sort of try to pressure the Russians. So I think that there's maybe an element of that. And for, countries, I think, which are, share a land border with Ukraine, we've had pieces of missiles land in countries, in places like Poland. There was early in the war, there was a Russian drone which ended up in Croatia, crash landing in Croatia, didn't injure anyone. But so this has sort of happened in the past. And so, there's sort of, you almost lose your patience, I think, in a lot of ways. And so there it becomes more a question of protecting your own citizens on the ground. But there is also an ancillary benefit. And so then the conversation becomes, well, do we push that out a bit further to try to protect some of the assets inside Ukraine and free up more air defenses for them to be able to protect their cities and their troops on the front lines. So
I'm fascinated by the point you made around avoiding a gray zone as just a principal objective, because a gray zone was what Ukraine found itself prior to the second invasion, which has once again led to the conflict situation we're in today. Could you articulate what you would say the difference between, let's say, the middle ground invitation you discussed, and once again, this is very early on, so it's broadly speaking, and let's say the 2000s era policy of inviting Ukraine to apply, which in many ways rhymes with what you're discussing here, but also once again kind of gave Ukraine like the worst of all possible worlds in terms of combining at least like the prospect without actually giving any of the benefits there. How should we understand the difference between the 2000s era policy failure and the opportunity we have in front of us today?
Well, that's right. And so, in the early 2000s, the idea was to talk about NATO membership for Ukraine as a future possibility, sort of an aspirational thing that you can, strive towards. That, well, one day, if you work hard enough, you can become a NATO member. If you can get corruption under control, if you can get your military up to sort of Western standards, then one day you can get there. But what that did is it was so nebulous that it allowed the Russians to essentially have a forever veto over Ukrainian NATO membership, because they could do things internally to keep corruption very problematic inside the country. You still had sort of the old Soviet mindset in terms of how a lot of Ukrainian military officers thought about war planning. And so you saw that in particular after the first invasion in 2014, that sort of thing reared its head. And so, for the Russians, Ukraine, I think, is somehow sort of the crown jewel in the way that their sort of imperial aspirations play out. And so you can't have a Russian empire in their mindset without a Ukraine. And so they always wanted to keep Ukraine as this sort of, quasi, in their minds, Russian state where they could sort of play with the economy and the leadership there. And while, Ukrainians could voice these sort of future aspirations towards NATO and NATO could say the right things too, they were never actually going to get there. And I think for some Western leaders, they were kind of happy to have that as a buffer state, right? To sort of have Ukraine in this sort of, nebulous netherworld, which was kind of kept the Russians a bit further away. And so the challenge now, I think, for the Western partners is to sort of get over that mental hump, which I think most of them have, but also now to telegraph to the Russians and to the Ukrainian people, more importantly, that there is no turning back, that their future will be in NATO, their future, if they're interested, which they are, will be in the European Union. So trying to integrate them, that there is going to be no sort of backsliding towards being caught in the middle and being forced back into sort of the Russian sphere, clawed back into it as the West lose interest, that their future will be in the West. And so all of the things that they're fighting for their homeland, that there is a better future ahead. And I think trying to impress upon the leadership in Moscow that this will never, that they're not going to be able to outlast the West. And so that's, I think, the difference in the way that we're thinking about that membership really is a real possibility for Ukraine, that they've done all the sort of steps when you think about being a Western military, being integrated, using Western systems, the difference now in corruption even versus just a decade ago. That they could be a NATO member today if it weren't for obviously the ongoing fighting, and so it's so different than I think when we were talking about this 25 years ago. But that has to be impressed upon all the parties involved that there is a real difference on the ground.
So you answered the rubric of Western military standards. Clearly, not only are they having the most, let's say, active military in Europe, but clearly there's been a change from the Soviet era. Speak about the second area where in the 2000s we expected progress from the Ukrainians on. Talk about the corruption side of things. What is the state of play in that category?
Well, it's no secret that the Ukraine had a corruption issue, not just in terms of military procurement, but across the economy. So you'd hear stories, about people if they, went to a doctor, maybe they might have to pay a bribe if they wanted to see a certain specialist or see it in a certain region. And so this was sort of the unfortunate legacy of the Soviet system and the sort of Soviet domination, forced domination after the Second World War. But there's been, I think, real efforts taken in terms of trying to make the judiciary independent and having prosecuting this sort of crimes. And I think that more importantly, the people of Ukraine don't want to live this way, right? And so I think that people fought against in their daily lives against having to pay bribes and sort of corruption and corrupt leaders. And so the difference that was made both in terms of legislation, but in terms of sort of society saying that they weren't interested in, especially young Ukrainians, made a huge difference. And so now, every time a U.S. military leader, for instance, is asked about, is there corruption which is siphoning away, certain amounts of U.S. I mean, they say no. We know, where these are cataloged, these are tagged, these pieces of equipment. We know where they're going. And there's obviously no interest on the Ukrainian side to have things being siphoned off on the black market and not making it to the troops on the front line. And so there's been such, I think, progress on the corruption question inside Ukraine, and always more that could be done. But I think we've come a long way. And so it should give Westerners, I think, a lot of confidence that there won't be any sort of backsliding. Because again, this is just another piece of the sort of Soviet legacy that the Ukrainians don't want to see. Sort of being, carrying on. I think after the war, this is another thing that they're fighting against, right? They want a Western system which is going to both attract investment and allow Ukrainians to live daily lives where they're absent this sort of sickness inside the country's economy.
Yeah, 100%. Something I'm curious about, once again, going back to the rubric in the mid-2000s of Western military standards and then corruption, the third rubric we could add, and this is the one which is awkward post-2014, is just territorial integrity. When it comes to previous NATO ascensions on a variety of levels, that has not been an issue which we've had to think through at the same level. How do you think through the question of what part or what total constituency of Ukraine is entering into NATO in the first place?
Well, that's what makes this case obviously unique. And so this is why you can issue an invitation and make it clear that this is where the endpoint is, but have the security situation on the ground be open to the member states' decision. And so clearly right now, you don't have a stable front line. We don't know what the end result is going to be. Hopefully, Ukraine is able to recover all of its seized territory, but that may not be where we end up, unfortunately, when all is said and done. So I think that has to be sort of where the conversation goes. But that can't be, I think the trap that we don't want to fall into is allowing any sort of Russian piece of territory being held onto inside Ukraine, being a de facto veto on future Ukrainian membership. And so the Russians have done this very effectively in places like Georgia, Moldova, where they've held on to, they've taken a chunk of these countries and they've held on to it. And that has self-defeated NATO in terms of not wanting to consider membership in a serious way for these countries because of that sort of open wound. And similarly in Ukraine, what we don't want to happen is if the Russians, if we're not able to dislodge, if the Ukrainians are not able to dislodge the Russians from pieces of their territory, to have that be a de facto veto on eventual Ukrainian membership, because again, that slides them back into this sort of gray zone. And so if at one point I think we do find ourselves with a stable front line, either with a ceasefire or the Ukrainians retaking most of their territory or whatever the conditions are, and you don't have this sort of active fighting or at least sort of the territory trading hands in the way it is now. Because even after the Minsk agreements in 2014, you still had potshots across the line. The Russians were constantly firing across the line and not actually, sort of abiding by the ceasefires. But you didn't have territory exchanging hands in the same way. I think that you could have, you could choose a certain dividing line and say, this is, the areas which are under Ukrainian control are now, covered by Article 5. And while we don't recognize Russia's accession of Crimea or, absorption of these pieces of Ukraine, they're under the present conditions not covered under Article 5, and that obviously could change in the future, but under the present conditions we find ourselves and they're not. I think that you could have that. I mean, look at the German example during the Cold War, right? The Western Germany was a NATO member, but Eastern Germany, while the government wasn't viewed as legitimate, it wasn't, of course, covered by Article 5 because it wasn't under control of the Federal Republic of Germany. So you could have something like that, and I think that it could work very effectively, but you have to have stable front lines in order to do that. And so this is another reason why I don't really think that the Russians have any interest in sort of a ceasefire or negotiated settlement. And part of that is because it would open the possibility, I think, of something like Ukrainian membership for most of the country happening in much shorter order.
Question then to follow up. Help me understand the thin line between avoiding giving the Russians a veto on NATO ascension, while also recognizing that in this case, the enemy clearly gets a vote when it comes to those end state conditions. How could we successfully attempt, at least, to balance those awkward dynamics?
Part of it is, I think, the clear messaging around Ukraine being in the alliance. So we talked a lot about this, but it has to be clear. An issue, an invitation has to be issued. Once again, at the Washington summit, there wasn't one issued. And so it was, I feel like the last few summits, the leaders at NATO have had to come up with more and more creative language around Ukraine's future. And so this year, the language that was clearly selected was around a bridge, a well-lit bridge, a bridge to the future, all this kind of thing. But ultimately, an invitation wasn't issued. And so that was, I think, a real missed opportunity and a disappointment. But you're right. I mean, the reality is that the facts on the ground are that right now the enemy does have a veto. And so what you have to do is you have to do everything in your power to allow the Ukrainians to win and to be successful and to retake their territory. And so to be able to, for themselves, seize this opportunity and this path for their future, right? And so I still think that so many Western leaders, especially here in the United States, are still so hesitant to do what needs to be done to allow the Ukrainians to be victorious. And we as a, one of the real challenges is around, I think that the urgency on the Western part in terms of industrial capacity is still pretty lackluster. And so that, I think, is another real challenge. But yeah, I mean, you're right. The enemy does have has a say in this, but the West also, I think, has a say in terms of helping the Ukrainians to get to a place where they can become NATO members and make other allies comfortable and having them join the alliance.
So last few questions here. What at the summit do you think the NATO member assessment of, let's say, the political instability in the United States was as relates to NATO moving into 2025? Obviously, at that point, President Biden hadn't dropped out of the race, but clearly he was in a precarious position. You obviously have the Trump candidacy and all of the sort of, let's say, perilous for NATO, but also contradictory. I think we could easily articulate on this podcast, a different episode, two different versions of a Trump presidency vis-a-vis NATO. So how were the member states internalizing this dynamic?
That's absolutely right. Marshall, as you know, Hudson was one of the partners for the NATO Public Forum, which is sort of the expert session, which runs concurrent to the official summit. So the official summit happened just a few blocks from our offices here at the Convention Center in Washington. And then there was a hotel next door where they had this public forum. And so you would have, a lot of sort of European thinkers and NGOs and military leaders there. And you had, their actual sort of civilian leaders also popping in from sessions. And this sort of was the kind of fog throughout the whole conference, I felt like, and through the whole summit, right? Where is the U.S. future, both in terms of what does a potential second term of a Trump administration mean, and what is the state of Biden's health, mental capacity, what happens there? And so I remember one of the nights driving home and listening to to President Biden's press conference where he was saying that he wasn't going to drop out, and these were all the reasons why, right? And so that was sort of this was the elephant in the room for everyone in terms of the U.S. still is the indispensable player inside NATO. I think that there actually are a lot of benefits to that, but obviously there are some downsides as well. But that is the reality, that Europe is not ready and is not going to be ready, in my view, for some time to be able to sort of take on all the roles that the U.S. plays in terms of ensuring collective defense is credible and deterrence is credible.
So last two here. So one at a time. Number one, clearly for the vast majority of NATO's existence, this was seen as an apolitical topic where there was just a strong bipartisan consensus. Obviously, the past decade or so has brought that era to a close. Moving forward, what are some broad principles or ideas we could have to try to get this back? And this could mean answering critics in some degrees. This could mean reform within the institution, different expectations, language, etc. What could we do over the coming years to bring this back to the center when it comes to a consensus perspective?
So I think three things. I think one is not on us. I think that our allies do need to step up in terms of putting money and investments into capabilities, real capabilities, because we found out that all these things, international law and treaties, they're all rest upon hard power. And if you don't have it, then you don't really have a say and you can't play the game, right? And so the U.S. can't be seen as the only one which is bringing anything to the party, right, in terms of capabilities. And so this is a political decision which is going to have to be made year in, year out by different parties of the political spectrum in European countries. And so I think that will go a long way in terms of helping rebuild this consensus in the U.S. The second is talking about the benefits, I think, of NATO membership for Americans. And there are many. And just one I would hit on here is that, we're facing a different threat from the Cold War. It was just the Soviet Union by and large, right? Now we're facing Russia with China, with Iran, with North Korea. And that's not even touching on sort of smaller threats. And so all of these countries are working together more consistently, doing it better. I mean, we just saw a week or two ago for the first time Chinese aircraft flying alongside Russians aircraft into U.S. airspace near Alaskan. It's never happened before. And so as all of these countries are sort of working together and for lack of a better term, working as allies, why would we want to jettison our greatest advantage, which is our network of alliances, not just in Europe, but also countries like Japan, Australia, and the Indo-Pacific, right? And so I think it's our leaders need to be better about making that case to the American public. And I think that, and this isn't a partisan thing, but presidents have been very lazy recently about making that case to Americans. I think Americans will get it and do get it, but it has to be put to them, right? And then the third thing I would say, Marshall, is that it would be nice if this became something which was once again seen as in the U.S. national interest, and so therefore was something which by and large was consistent across administrations, whether or not the parties changed hands, because now we've had in the last few years these wild swings in policy. And so you have these questions like we just talked about. What is the U.S. policy going to be if parties change hands? What is policy going to be if there's a new president? And so that's not good for our allies in terms of their planning. And it's also not really good in terms of messaging to our adversaries, because there's always this question about whether or not there's a window of opportunity which will open up, which is going to be better for them in a few years, right? Well, if we just hold out for this war for a few more years, things are going to be better for us, and that'll be our real opportunity. And so we need to make U.S. policy in terms of foreign policy be much more consistent across administrations, because it's better for messaging and it's better for our own planning in terms of our own defense procurement and how we're thinking about how we spend our own defense dollars and foreign aid dollars and this sort of thing. There can be some cosmetic changes, but by and large, the U.S. national interest shouldn't change if the person who's sitting in the White House is different. And so I'd like to see a little more consistency on that level as well.
Last question that also ties this together with the Indo-Pacific. If we understand, let's say, a broad objective of the United States during the Cold War, it was maintaining peace and stability in Europe, specifically in the wake of World War I and World War II. As we're looking at the emerging great power competition that we're all experiencing, which goes by a bunch of different unsettled names, it's clear, though, in the 21st century, a stable and peaceful Indo-Pacific is one of the main objectives we're going to hold as a country, and that's largely bipartisanly shared. What lessons and tools does NATO's existence offer us for this other region, which demands our attention just as much?
Well, I think that there are a couple things. One is that, in my view, what happens in Ukraine, what happens in the transatlantic sphere is going to be very determinative in terms of how the Chinese decide to act in the next few years, the next decade, right? I think that they're looking very closely at the U.S. and Western staying power and resolve and support for Ukraine. And so they're going to be making their own calculations, I think, in terms of how they move in the future based on where we end in the transatlantic sphere. So that's one thing. Two, there are obviously there are synergies now, which didn't exist a few years ago between all of these Iran, Russia, China, and so they're sort of learning from each other, they're learning from the war. But we are as well. For instance, we're using AI to look at Russian artillery strikes and trying to determine what that looks like. And we've seen, of course, it's a whole nother conversation, the evolution of sort of warfare and what that's meant and what that could mean for a future conflict. But so I think in terms of staving off a war in the Indo-Pacific, I think that it is crucial that Ukraine and the West is successful in handing a strategic defeat to the Russians in terms of and to keep peace in the Indo-Pacific. I really believe that. So that's one piece. And the second piece is that, look, there are European countries which are NATO members, which are European powers, the French in particular. And so they were going to have interests and assets which can be brought to bear in a future conflict. Of course, there's the economic argument about sanctions and sort of trying to throttle components for Chinese systems in the future conflict. And there's also, I think, the messaging with this sort of broader Western world in that if our allies in the Indo-Pacific see us cutting bait in Europe, I think that they're going to have a lot of questions about the U.S. staying power. Then there's the sort of nuclear deterrent. What happens there if the U.S. nuclear deterrent isn't seen as something which is stable or reliable? So I think that there's these. When I started 10, 15 years ago, I felt like everything was much more stovepipe, at least in terms of how we thought about it. Now everything is so interconnected. And so I think that it's so much of what is happening in the transatlantic sphere is directly related to what is going on in other regions, including in the Indo-Pacific. And so the best thing that we can do in terms of being successful in the future in the Indo-Pacific and stopping larger scale hostilities there is to be successful in the transatlantic sphere. And I think that the last thing I would say, Marshall, is that we need to have a national level conversation about what our interests and our responsibilities are in the broader sphere, and what do we need as a country in order to make that happen. And so our President John Waters had a conversation during the public forum with Senator Wicker, who talks about the real need for the U.S. defense spending to go up substantially in terms of an investment. And then that, of course, is going to have, then you have to have larger conversation around spending and in sort of a domestic context as well. But that's probably the reality, that we're relying upon systems by and large from the 80s. And so if we want to be able to play in all these different theaters, then we need to rethink probably the kind of investment in terms of both military, but also in terms of money, but also in terms of personnel, and how do we up recruitment and these sorts of things. So it's a broader picture and broader conversation, but I think that these two theaters are so indelibly linked. And so right now the war is in Europe, and so we need to do everything that we can in terms of helping Ukraine to be successful in handing the Russians a strategic defeat, because it'll pay dividends down the line in the Indo-Pacific as well.
Daniel, very well said. Thank you for joining me on Arsenal of Democracy.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on today. It was a real great conversation.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.